The airplane in the photograph does not look right. Even now, more than 80 years later, when you find one of the surviving examples on the tarmac at an air show in Ohio, or hanging from the ceiling of an aviation museum in Florida, or parked outside a hangar in California, the first thing you noticed about it is the nose. Most of the airplanes of the Second World War have graceful, curving plexiglass noses made for a bombardier to sit behind and look through. This one does not. This one has a flat, squared-off, ugly metal snout. And in that snout, if you look closely, you can count 8 black holes staring forward. 4 in the nose itself. 4 more, 2 on each side of the fuselage, just behind the cockpit. 8 .50 caliber machine guns bolted into a medium bomber that no one at that factory had ever intended to be a gunship. This is the story of how those 8 guns got into that nose, and of the war they ended. The name of the airplane is B-25 Mitchell. Twin engine, 6-man crew. Designed by North American Aviation in Inglewood, California, in the last months before the United States entered the Second World War. 2 Wright R-2600 radial engines, 1 on each wing. Maximum bomb load, 3,000 pounds. 2 .50 caliber machine guns in a glass nose. 1 .30 caliber gun in the tail. 1 flexible gun for the navigator. It was a medium bomber. It flew high, it flew straight, it dropped bombs, it went home. That was the doctrine of 1941. That was what medium bombers did. And in that role, in the first year of the Pacific War, the B-25 was a disappointment. Not because it was a bad aircraft, it was a very good aircraft. Rugged, forgiving, easy to fly. It carried a heavier bomb load than most of its contemporaries, and it could take hits and keep flying. In April of 1942, Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle led 16 B-25s off the deck of the aircraft carrier Hornet and bombed Tokyo. And for a moment, America believed the B-25 was the future of aerial warfare. But the war in the Southwest Pacific was not the war over Tokyo. It was a war of ships. Japanese transports moving down the Solomons. Japanese destroyers running supplies through the slot at night. Japanese cruisers appearing off Guadalcanal, off New Guinea, off Rabaul. Everything the Empire of Japan needed to hold what it had taken in the first 6 months of the war depended on the Imperial Navy's ability to move troops and supplies by sea. And everything the Americans and Australians needed to stop that empire depended on their ability to sink those ships. The B-25 could not sink those ships. Dropped from 10,000 feet, a 500-pound bomb takes almost 30 seconds to hit the water. In 30 seconds, a destroyer moving at 25 knots covers over 400 yards. A convoy commander who spots the falling bombs simply turns his ship. The bombs land in empty ocean. The bombers fly home. The transports keep sailing. In the first 8 months of 1942, American and Australian bombers in the Southwest Pacific flew hundreds of medium and heavy bomber sorties against Japanese shipping. Their hit rate on moving vessels was under 3%. 3%. 97 bombs out of every 100 fell into the sea and killed nothing but fish. The Japanese Navy noticed. Japanese convoy commanders learned that American high-altitude bombing was a nuisance, not a threat. They learned to steam confidently, in daylight, through waters that should have been dangerous. They learned that the 8,000-foot altitude at which American bombers preferred to drop their loads was safer for the ships below than it was for the bombers above. The pride of American medium bomber design, the airplane that had bombed Tokyo, was becoming a joke on the front line where the war was actually being fought. And in Brisbane, Australia, in the summer of 1952, a 42-year-old former Navy Chief Petty Officer named Paul Irvin Gunn was watching this happen and quietly going mad. His friends called him Pappy, not because he was old, because he had 4 children and treated the young pilots around him like they were his own. Pappy Gunn had spent 21 years in the United States Navy as an aviation mechanist's mate and an enlisted pilot. He had left the service in 1939 to manage a small commercial airline in the Philippines called Philippine Airlines. He had a wife named Clara, whom everyone called Polly. He had 2 sons, Paul Jr. and Nath. He had 2 daughters, Connie and Julie. In December of 1941, he had them all with him in Manila. Then the war came on the 24th of December, 1941, as Japanese forces closed in on the Philippine capital. Pappy Gunn was ordered to fly a group of American general officers to safety in Australia. He kissed his wife on the tarmac. He held each of his 4 children, and then he took off, because he was a soldier, and because he had been told to. He believed his family would be safe. They were civilians. They lived in a neutral apartment. He told Polly, before he left, to tell the Japanese if they asked that her husband was dead in a plane crash. He believed her. He believed them. On the 20th of January, 1942, Japanese military police arrested Polly Gunn and all 4 children and interned them in the Santo Tomas civilian prison camp in Manila, along with 3,000 other Allied nationals. Pappy Gunn learned this weeks later from another American pilot who had escaped the Philippines. From that day forward, everything Pappy Gunn did in the war was calculated toward a single goal. Not revenge, not glory, not promotion. He wanted his family back. And he understood with the cold clarity of a man who has done the arithmetic and cannot stand the answer, that his family would not come back until the Japanese army stopped receiving reinforcements in the Philippines. And the Japanese army would not stop receiving reinforcements until American bombers learned how to sink Japanese ships, which they had not learned to do. So in the tin-roofed hangars of Eagle Farm Airfield, near Brisbane, in the summer of 1942, Pappy Gunn began to think about the B-25 in a way that no one at North American Aviation had ever thought about it. The bombardier position, he decided, was useless. A bombardier existed to aim bombs falling from high altitude. If you were not bombing from high altitude, you did not need a bombardier. You needed his space. The plexiglass nose, he decided, was useless. It was a window for a man who was not going to be there anymore. Behind that window was space for something else, space for guns, space for a lot of guns. Working with a North American Aviation Field Service representative named Jack Fox, Pappy Gunn took a hacksaw to the nose of a B-25C in a tin shed on the far side of the world. He cut away the plexiglass. He removed the bomb sight, the bombardier's seat, and the flexible .30 caliber mount. And into the hollow space where that man used to sit and stare at the world through his window of glass, Pappy Gunn began to install machine guns. 4 50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, bolted directly into the airframe, fixed, forward firing, aimed by pointing the whole airplane. On the sides of the fuselage, just behind the cockpit, he added 4 more 50 calibers in armored blister packages, 2 on each side, fixed, forward firing, 8 guns, all pointing the same direction, all firing at the same target, all controlled by a single trigger under the pilot's right thumb. More forward firepower than a P-38 Lightning. More forward firepower than a P-47 Thunderbolt. More forward firepower than any American fighter aircraft in service. Bolted into the nose of a medium bomber that no one had ever intended to be a gunship. The airplane looked wrong when he was done. The graceful glass nose replaced by a squared-off metal snout. The clean lines of the fuselage broken by the ugly bulges of the package gun blisters. It looked like something a garage mechanic had built on a Sunday afternoon. It was. In August of 1942, Major General George Churchill Kenney arrived in Brisbane to take command of the 5th Air Force. He was 53 years old. He had spent his career fighting the doctrine that said heavy bombers won wars by bombing cities from 10,000 feet. He had come to the Southwest Pacific looking for something different. Something that would actually kill Japanese ships and Japanese airfields. On his first inspection tour of the depot at Eagle Farm, he walked into a tin shed and saw a modified B-25 with 8 machine guns bolted into its nose. He turned to the officer, showing him around. Who did this? The officer told him. Kenney looked at the airplane for a long time. Then he walked out of the shed to find the man who had done it. He found Pappy Gunn in a hangar office cluttered with parts diagrams, spent shell casings, and a coffee cup that had not been washed since the fall of Bataan. Gunn was a captain in the Army Air Forces by then, given the rank because the Army needed to put uniforms on the men doing the fighting. But he had spent 21 years in the Navy, and he did not stand for generals unless he felt like it. Kenney did not care. Show me what you did to my airplane. They walked out to the flight line together. Gunn walked Kenney around the modified B-25 the way a farmer walks a buyer around a mule. He showed him the reinforced nose plate. He showed him the ammunition trays feeding 400 rounds per gun. He showed him where he had removed the bombardier's oxygen bottle and put a 5th ammunition can. He showed him the trigger linkage he had welded together from spare parts. Kenney asked one question. Will it fly? Gunn told him it would fly. Gunn told him it would do more than fly. Gunn told him that if the general would give him 6 B-25s and 6 weeks, he would give the general back an airplane that could sink Japanese destroyers. Kenney gave him 12, and he gave him something more valuable than 12 airplanes. He gave him cover, because within days of that meeting, a teletype arrived from Wright Field, Ohio. Wright Field was the technical brain of the United States Army Air Forces. It was where engineers with slide rules and calipers decided what airplanes could do and what they could not do. And the engineers at Wright Field had heard about what was happening in Brisbane, and they were not happy. The teletype was official. The language was cold. The message was simple. The modifications being performed on B-25 aircraft in the Southwest Pacific violated the manufacturer's specifications. The center of gravity had been shifted forward by a dangerous amount. The airframe stresses could not be certified. The modifications were unauthorized. All modified aircraft were to be grounded immediately pending inspection by a technical team from Wright Field. Kenny read the teletype in his office and thought about it for a long time. Then he put it in his desk drawer and closed the drawer. Pappy Gunn, when told about the teletype, is said to have dictated a reply. Whether he actually sent it is disputed. Whether Kenny let it go out is disputed. But the reply, as it was passed from pilot to pilot in the officers' clubs of the 5th Air Force for the rest of the war, went something like this. Tell Wright Field to put the center of gravity in a warehouse. We still have a war to fight. The teletypes stopped coming. Wright Field, for reasons no one at Wright Field ever explained, dropped the matter. And the B-25 gunship, born in a tin shed in Australia against the express orders of the United States Army Air Forces, was allowed to live. Now it had to prove itself. Kenny gave the modified B-25s to the 90th Bombardment Squadron of the 3rd Attack Group at Port Moresby, New Guinea, and he gave command of that squadron to a young captain named Ed Larner. Larner was 25 years old. He had been raised in San Francisco, California. He had come out to the Southwest Pacific in October of 1942 and made a name for himself so fast that senior pilots had already learned his last name. Kenny recommended him for promotion. Larner made major in the last weeks of 1942. Other pilots described him with a word they used carefully in that year of the war. Because pilots who deserved the word usually did not live long enough to hear it said about them again. Reckless. Larner heard the word and did not argue with it. He took his new squadron and his new airplanes to the northern coast of Papua, to an airstrip cut out of the jungle at WWII, and he began the training. 6 miles off the coast of Port Moresby, a British freighter called the SS Pruth had run aground on a reef 1923. The wreck had been sitting on that reef for 20 years, rusting in the tropical sun, its bow angled up out of the shallow water like the finger of a dead man pointing at the sky. And in January and February of 1943, Ed Larner and the pilots of the 90th Bombardment Squadron began to attack that wreck. Over and over and over. They flew at 60 feet above the ocean, low enough that the propeller wash of the twin Wright engines tore parallel white streaks across the water behind each aircraft, low enough that a wave crest, if it came at the wrong moment, could kill you. They came in at 280 miles an hour, throttles, firewalled, and weighed, and they aimed the entire airplane at the wreck of the Pruth, as if the airplane itself were the bullet. At 1,500 yards, Larner taught them, you press the trigger. 8 guns. 6,800 rounds per minute. The tracers reached out from the nose of the bomber in 8 solid lines of light, converging on the target, walking up the side of the rusted freighter, chewing metal that had already been rusting for 20 years and turning it to dust. The gun run lasted 8 seconds. In those 8 seconds, more than 900 armor-piercing, incendiary rounds left the airplane. Then at 300 yards, still at 60 feet above the water, the pilot pickled his bombs. 2 500-pound demolition bombs with 4-second delay fuses. The bombs did not fall. They skipped, flat, spinning across the water like river stones thrown by a boy at a pond. 1 bounce, 2 bounces, sometimes 3. Then they slammed into the hull of the Pruth at the waterline and buried themselves in what was left of her cargo holds. 4 seconds later, They exploded. The pilots learned to pull up hard and turn away in the same motion because the fireball from a 500-pound bomb with a delay fuse reached higher than 60 feet, and a slow pilot flew through his own bomb blast. Some of them did. 2 pilots died at the Pruth in training. One of them tried to fly through his own bomb blast and did not come out the other side. The other one hit a wave crest and cartwheeled into the sea at 280 miles an hour. Larner watched both of them go. He said nothing to the survivors that night. He got up before dawn the next morning and led them out to the wreck again. The men who flew for him understood, without being told, that they were being asked to do something that no medium bomber crew had ever been asked to do before. They were being asked to fly into the guns. And here, before this story goes any further, one more thing must be said. Because the story of the B-25 gunship is often told as if one man built it alone. That is not what happened. The technique that Ed Larner was teaching, the technique that would decide the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, was called skip bombing. And it was not invented by Ed Larner. It was not invented by Pappy Gunn. It was not invented by the 3rd Attack Group. It was invented by a major named William G. Benn of the 43rd Bombardment Group. And he did it with B-17 heavy bombers. In the summer and fall of 1942, Benn had experimented with dropping bombs at low altitude from B-17s, learning by trial and error that a bomb released at exactly the right height and speed would skip across the water and strike a ship at the waterline. He led the first successful skip bombing attack on the 23rd of October, 1942. He passed the technique on to the rest of the 5th Air Force. And then, on the 18th of January, 1940, 6 weeks before the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, Major William G. Benn took off on a routine flight over New Guinea and did not come back. His B-17 disappeared into the Owen Stanley Mountains. His body was never recovered. The technique that would sink the Japanese convoy at the Bismarck Sea belonged to a man who had already been dead for 6 weeks by the time the convoy sailed. The pilots of the 90th Bombardment Squadron did not talk about this, but they knew it. Every man who came back from a practice run at the Pruth wreck knew it. The airplane they were flying and the technique they were flying with had both come from somewhere else. From someone else. From a chain of men, most of whom would never see war end. On the 28th of February, 1943, at 1900 hours, a convoy of 16 ships left Simpson Harbor at Rabaul. Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura commanded from the bridge of the destroyer Shirayuki. Under his flag were 7 other destroyers, Shikinami Uranami, Tokitsukaze, Yukikaze, Asashio, Arashio, Asagumo, 8 destroyers total, screening 8 transports. On board those transports were approximately 6,900 officers and men of the 51st Infantry Division, sent to reinforce the garrison of Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi at Lae, on the north coast of New Guinea. Kimura had reason to be confident. The weather forecast promised heavy overcast and rain squalls. Along his route, the kind of weather that made American air attack difficult. His anti-aircraft defenses included dual-purpose 5-inch guns on every destroyer and dozens of 25mm cannons across the convoy. His men had been drilled for exactly this kind of voyage. and the record of American bombing against Japanese ships in these waters for the past year was almost too poor to be worth worrying about. He did not know that the weather forecast was wrong. He did not know that the overcast would break up during the day of March 3rd. He did not know that the American 5th Air Force had spent the past 4 months preparing an aircraft that had never before been used against ships in combat on a large scale. And he did not know that at first light on the morning of March 3rd, 90 Allied aircraft would take off from Port Moresby with a single mission: sink the convoy. All of it. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea would not be won by one aircraft. It would be won by an alliance. B-17 heavy bombers of the 43rd Bombardment Group would attack from 10,000 feet, drawing every Japanese anti-aircraft gun on every ship in the convoy up to high angle, up to the sky. Bristol Beaufighters of No. 30 Squadron, Royal Australian Air Force, would come in at mast height with 4 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns, hosing the decks of the destroyers, killing the gun crews before they could depress their weapons. A 20 Havoc light bombers of the 89th Attack Squadron would follow, and in the days that followed, PT boats of Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 21, under Lieutenant Commander Barry Atkins, would finish in the darkness what the airplanes had begun in the daylight. But at the center of that alliance, at the cutting edge, would be 12 B-25 Mitchell medium bombers with 8 machine guns bolted into their noses, flying at 60 feet above the sea, aimed by the whole airplane, triggered by a single thumb. At 1000 hours on the morning of March 3rd, 1943, Major Ed Larner led the 90th Bombardment Squadron down through a break in the clouds over the Bismarck Sea. His own aircraft was a B-25C named Spook II. He had named the airplane after his wife. Ahead of him, in perfect formation, sailed 16 Japanese ships. Larner picked a destroyer at the head of the escort screen and aimed Spook II at her bridge. At 1,200 yards, he pressed the trigger. 8 machine guns fired together. Behind him, the other pilots of the 90th Bombardment Squadron picked their own targets and made their own passes. Every gun crew in the convoy had exactly 1.5 seconds to understand what was happening to them before the first 100 rounds arrived on their bridges. They did not have time. Rounds of 50 caliber armor-piercing, incendiary ammunition, weighing more than an ounce apiece, traveling at almost 3,000 feet per second, tore into the thin steel of Japanese destroyer superstructures, like awls punching through tin cans. Bridge windows exploded in showers of glass. Gun shields provided no protection. Anti-aircraft crews were cut down at their weapons before they could depress the barrels to engage the low-flying attackers. Fires started in ready ammunition lockers and spread. Then the skip bombs came. 500-pound demolition bombs released at 300 yards, skipping flat across the water, slamming into destroyer hulls at the waterline, burying themselves in engine rooms and magazines before the 4-second delay fuses detonated. The destroyer at the head of the escort screen, which had been the flagship of Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura, was broken in half. Her sister ships followed, one after another, into the same water. The transports had no chance at all. Kembu Maru, Oigawa Maru, Taime Maru, Ayo Maru, Shinai Maru, Teo Maru, Nojima, Kyokusei Maru, every single one, sunk or burning by nightfall on March 3rd. The soldiers of the 51st Infantry Division packed into the cargo, holds in full combat gear. Most of them did not reach the surface of the water. The ones who did, in the days that followed, were strafed in the water and in their lifeboats by returning American and Australian aircraft, under orders from General Kenny to prevent any Japanese reinforcement of Lae by any means available. Of the 6,900 soldiers who had sailed from Rabaul, approximately 1,200 reached Lae alive, most of them picked up by Japanese submarines under cover of darkness. General Adachi never received the reinforcements he had been promised. The Japanese position on the north coast of New Guinea from that day forward was a position that could no longer be supplied from the sea. In Tokyo, Admiral Roku Yamamoto received the report of the Bismarck Sea disaster and understood, before his staff did, what it meant. He issued the order the same day. No large convoy of the Imperial Japanese Navy would ever again attempt to move troops through waters within range of 5th Air Force B-25s in daylight. The Japanese Navy would later assess, in its own post-war accounting, that the method of attack encountered at the Bismarck Sea was unlike anything their doctrine had prepared for or their pre-war training had imagined possible. The war in the South Pacific had just changed, not because a new battleship had been launched, not because a new fleet had arrived, not because a new admiral had taken command, but because a former Navy chief petty officer named Pappy Gunn had cut the nose off a medium bomber with a hacksaw in a tin shed in Australia, and because a 25-year-old major named Ed Larner had flown that medium bomber at 60 feet above the sea, straight into the guns of a Japanese destroyer. And because 8 .50 caliber machine guns firing together had done in 15 minutes what a year of high-altitude bombing had not been able to do. The B-25 Mitchell, the medium bomber that had been a disappointment, the airplane that Japanese convoy commanders had learned to laugh at, had learned how to kill ships. And this was only the beginning. After the Bismarck Sea, Ed Larner became a legend of the 5th Air Force. The story of the young major who had flown at 60 feet into the guns of a Japanese destroyer spread through every officers' club from Brisbane to Darwin. Reporters wanted his picture. Colonels wanted to shake his hand. General Kenny wrote his name in dispatches sent back to Washington. Ed Larner, 25 years old, small and quiet on the ground, precise in the air, had become the face of the B-25 gunship revolution. 58 days after the Bismarck Sea, Ed Larner was dead. He did not die in combat over water. He did not die over a Japanese destroyer with 8 machine guns firing from the nose of his airplane. He died on his own airfield, in his own airplane, on a runway he had landed on 100 times. On the morning of April 30th, 1943, Major Ed Larner was returning to the airstrip at WWII from a combat mission against the Japanese airfield at Nadzab. His B-25 was heavy, full fuel tanks, 2,000 pounds of unspent bombs still in the racks, baggage, tools, 8 men aboard, including passengers. He did what he had always done when he came home. He put the airplane into a low, fast down the runway at 50 feet, and at the far end of the runway, he pulled the yoke back hard into his chest and hauled the B-25 up into a climbing turn called a chandelle. He had done it 100 times. The men who flew for him had done it 100 times. It was the trademark of the 90th Bombardment Squadron, the little bit of showmanship that told the ground crews their pilots were home. This time, the airplane did not respond the way it had responded the other 100 times. It was carrying 2,000 pounds of bombs that it usually did not carry on the way home. It was carrying passengers it usually did not carry. Its wings were loaded heavier than they had ever been loaded during a chandelle. When Larner pulled up, the B-25 stalled at the top of the maneuver. It rolled off onto one wing, and it fell out of the sky into a flat spin from which it could not recover. Ed Larner was killed instantly. 7 other men died with him, his co-pilot, his navigator, 4 crewmen, and 1 passenger who had hitched a ride home to Dobodura. The man who had shown the world what a B-25 with 850 caliber machine guns could do had been killed by the very airplane he had made famous. Not by a Japanese destroyer, not by anti-aircraft fire, by the trademark maneuver he had performed 100 times and could not stop performing. By the exact quality the other pilots had, from the beginning, tried to warn him about. Reckless. The B-25 did not stop. The men who had trained with Larner did not stop. The airplane went on. WWII, on the north coast of New Guinea, August 17, 1943. B-25 gunships hit 4 Japanese airfields at treetop level in successive waves. Japanese fighters and bombers parked in orderly rows because Japanese commanders still could not imagine what a low-level American attack looked like were caught on the ground. Dozens of aircraft were destroyed. The Japanese 4th Air Army lost the striking power it had built up over months. Many of the pilots and ground crews died in the trenches beside their burning airplanes. Rabaul, Simpson Harbor, November 2nd, 1943. This was the strongest Japanese naval anchorage south of the home islands. It was defended by hundreds of anti-aircraft guns and fighter squadrons at multiple airfields. 75 B-25 gunships of the 3rd Attack Group and the 38th Bombardment Group swept across the harbor at mast height. In 12 minutes, they left the anchorage burning. 9 B-25s were shot down. Many more came back with damage. But when the smoke cleared, the Imperial Japanese Navy made a decision that changed the rest of the war in the South Pacific. It abandoned Rabaul as a major fleet base. The fortress that had been built at enormous cost, the anchorage from which the Bismarck Sea convoy had sailed, the possession that Japanese strategists had called unassailable, was now considered too dangerous to keep the ships in. From that day forward, Rabaul was slowly starved, bypassed, and left to wither behind Allied lines for the rest of the war. Biak, June 8, 1944. Japanese destroyers of Operation Ko-on, trying to slip through to reinforce the garrison, were intercepted by B-25 gunships of the 17th Reconnaissance Squadron off Manokwari. The destroyer Harusam took armor-piercing incendiary fire from the 8-gun noses and then absorbed skip bombs into her engine spaces. She went down. The reinforcement mission was aborted. The Japanese garrison at Biak was left to fight without support. Everywhere the B-25 gunship arrived, the same story repeated itself. Japanese naval officers wrote it in their reports. The Americans, they said, had built an aircraft that killed ships from directly ahead. At wave-top height, with more forward-firing guns than a fighter, and there was no defense against it. Back in the United States, at the North American Aviation plant in Kansas City, engineers were reading the combat reports from the Pacific. They looked at the modifications that Pappy Gunn had done with a hacksaw in a tin shed in Australia. They looked at the results, and they did what they had said could not be done. They put the 8-gun nose into the factory. The B-25J-22 rolled off the Kansas City production line in late 1944 with 8 50 caliber machine guns bolted into a solid metal nose. 4 package guns on the fuselage sides, 2 guns in a top turret, 2 in the waist, 2 in the tail, 18 50 caliber machine guns on a single aircraft. More forward firepower than 3 P-51 Mustangs put together. Wright Field, Ohio, which had once ordered the Australian modifications grounded, now certified them as factory standard. Pappy Gunn's hacksaw had won. By this time, Pappy Gunn was no longer in Brisbane. He had followed the war north. Promoted first to major and then to lieutenant colonel, he had traveled with the 5th Air Force as it moved up through New Guinea and into the Western Pacific. Always closer to the Philippines, always closer to Manila, always closer to Santo Tomas and the wife and 4 children he had not seen in 3 years. On the 24th of October, 1944, the light aircraft carrier USS Princeton was struck by a Japanese dive bomber off the coast of Leyte during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Her aviation gasoline caught fire. Her ammunition magazines detonated. Late that afternoon, she was scuttled by torpedoes from her own escort. 30 of her aircraft were still in the air when she went down. They had no home to return to. The only strip of American runway within their fuel range was a half-finished airfield at Tacloban, on the island of Leyte, which General Kenny had ordered, scraped out of the mud only weeks before. Tacloban had no landing lights. It was raining. The cloud ceiling was 200 feet. It was nearly dark. 30 Navy pilots were about to run out of fuel over the Pacific Ocean. Pappy Gunn, who had spent 21 years in the United States Navy as an aviation mechanic and enlisted pilot, understood exactly what those pilots needed. He had done it himself as a young man on the deck of a carrier. He knew what a landing signal officer looked like from the cockpit of an approaching aircraft. He tied 2 flashlights to the ends of 2 long bamboo poles. He walked out to the end of the muddy runway at Tacloban in the rain, and he stood in the darkness with 2 flashlights on 2 sticks. And he brought 30 Navy pilots home. Not one aircraft was lost. Not one pilot died that night. 2 weeks later, on the same airfield, the war finally caught up with Pappy Gunn. A Japanese bomber, coming in low under the cloud cover, dropped a white phosphorus incendiary bomb on the flight line at Tacloban. Pappy Gunn was caught in the open. Burning phosphorus fragments struck his upper left arm and his left shoulder. Phosphorus does not stop burning when it hits flesh. It continues to burn as long as there is oxygen and tissue for it to consume. The wounds were terrible. The arm was destroyed as a functional limb. He was evacuated by hospital plane to a military hospital in Brisbane, Australia. His war was over. On the 3rd of February, 1945, on the direct order of General Douglas MacArthur, a task force of the 1st Cavalry Division executed what MacArthur called a flying wedge, a fast armored thrust straight into occupied Manila to liberate the prisoners of Santo Tomas before the Japanese garrison could kill them. Colonel Dave Hutchinson, commanding officer of the 308th Bombardment Wing, was attached to the operation with one personal instruction from MacArthur himself. Find the Gunn family. They found them. Pappy Gunn, malnourished and exhausted, was still alive. Paul Jr. was alive. Nath was alive. Connie was alive. Julie, weakened by disease contracted in the camp, was in a body cast, but still alive. All 5 of them had survived 3 years and 2 weeks of Japanese internment. 2 weeks after the liberation of Santo Tomas, General MacArthur himself visited the camp. He met the Gunn family. He looked at Polly. He looked at the 4 children. And then he gave the order that put all 5 of them on a military aircraft bound for Australia. The reunion did not happen on a runway in Manila. It did not happen at the front gate of Santo Tomas. It happened in a hospital ward in Brisbane, in a room that smelled of iodine and burned tissue. Pappy Gunn was lying in a bed with his left arm bandaged to the shoulder. His wife and 4 children walked in through the door together for the first time in 3 years and 2 weeks and 13 days. Julie walked in on legs that had barely recovered from her body cast. Polly did not recognize her husband at first because he had lost 30 pounds and aged 10 years. Pappy did not recognize his youngest daughter at first because she had been a child in 1941, and she was now a girl who had spent 3 years in a prison camp. No one in the family ever wrote down what was said in that hospital room. Some things are not for the written record. The B-25 gunships that Pappy Gunn had built kept flying for the last 10 months of the war. They hit Formosa. They hit the Ryukyus. They hit Japanese shipping in the inland sea. On the 14th of August, 1945, the same day the Emperor of Japan announced his surrender, B-25 gunships of the 5th Air Force were still finding Japanese vessels to sink. Then it was over. Pappy Gunn recovered, though his left arm never fully returned to him. He was retired from the United States Army Air Forces on the 30th of June, 1948, at the rank of colonel, on account of physical disability from his wounds at Tacloban. He returned to Manila. He rebuilt the Philippine Airlines routes he had been flying before the war. He raised his 4 children. He grew old. On the 11th of October, 1957, 1 week before what would have been his 58th birthday, Colonel Paul Irvin Gunn was flying a chartered aircraft from Manila towards Cebu when he encountered a tropical storm over the central Philippines. He attempted to divert around the weather. His aircraft went down. There were no survivors. The man who had walked out of Bataan alive, who had built the airplane that changed a war in the Pacific, who had cut the nose off a B-25 with a hacksaw in a tin shed and made the Japanese Navy give up its harbors, was killed by a thunderstorm on a commercial charter flight in peacetime. He was brought home to the United States and buried at Barrancas National Cemetery at Naval Air Station, Pensacola, Florida. It was the same base where he had begun his career as an 18-year-old aviation mechanic's mate in the last months of the First World War. The B-25 gunship outlived him. The concept that Pappy Gunn had built with a hacksaw in Brisbane, the idea that a large aircraft could carry more firepower than a fighter and deliver it against ground and surface targets at close range, did not end with the Second World War. It became the founding principle of a new kind of American combat aircraft. The AC-47 Spooky over Vietnam in the 1960s was a descendant of the B-25 gunship. So was the AC-130 Spectre. So was the A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog, whose massive 30mm cannon in the nose is the great-grandchild of 850 caliber machine guns bolted into a medium bomber in a tin shed in Australia in the summer of 1942. Every American close air support aircraft built since 1945 owes something to the B-25 gunship. Every gunship that has flown in every American war since owes something to the airplane that Pappy Gunn cut apart with a hacksaw and that Ed Larner flew at 60 feet above the Bismarck Sea, straight into the guns of a Japanese destroyer. The B-25 Mitchell, the medium bomber that could not sink a ship in 1942, ended the war as the ship killer that had broken the Imperial Japanese Navy's ability to move by sea. The airplane is still with us. There are perhaps 40 B-25s still flying in the world today, restored and maintained by warbird museums and private owners across the United States. Some of them still carry the 8-gun nose that Pappy Gunn designed. They fly at air shows every summer over crowds of grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the men who once flew them into combat. The two Wright R-2600 engines still sound the way they sounded over the Bismarck Sea. The 8 black holes in the nose still stare forward the way they stared at Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura on the morning of March 3rd, 1943. The men who flew them are almost all gone now. The airplane they flew has outlived them. And somewhere in the sky above Barrancas National Cemetery in Pensacola, Florida, on quiet afternoons in late summer, if you listen carefully, you can still sometimes hear the sound of 2 Wright radial engines coming in low from the direction of the Gulf. The way they came in low over the Bismarck Sea. On the morning that a former Navy chief petty officer with a hacksaw and a 25-year-old major with a reckless streak taught the United States Army Air Forces how to kill ships.